Hey, go ahead, Lewis. Welcome.
Well, and thank you for participating and attending today. I want to talk to you about what the Department of Corrections is doing in terms of housing assistance and helping reentrants make that transition back out into the community. So I'm going to talk about three different programs. One is a community correction center, and I want to kind of use the community correction centers as to set the context, right? As to how it is that we got to the housing assistance program, and then how we evolved then into the REACH program. So it's important to talk about community correction centers first. So some of you might be familiar with a community correction center, sometimes called CCCs. Um, and if they're a contract facility we call them CCFs, or community contract facilities. If you could drop in the chat, what comes to mind when you hear about community correction centers? If anything that immediately comes to your mind when you hear that term. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So in the community corrections center, they tend to be physical locations, these big buildings out in the community that help people transition back out into the community. Pictured here, and I trust that you can see the pictures, is three different centers. One is on the upper left is the Johnstown Community Correction Center, which used to be an infirmary for a steel company in Johnstown back in the day. The one in the lower left is the Wernersville Community Correction Center, which is a state hospital. It's on the state hospital grounds. It's a building that the state hospital no longer uses, so we occupy that space. And then we have the Pittsburgh Community Correction Center, which was an old mansion. I guess it still is a mansion, but it's not used as a mansion. It's used as a community correction center. And what you find here is that no two community correction centers are the same. But what's important to know about a community correction center is that folks that are making that transition from incarceration back out into the community, they have to transition through a community correction center, oftentimes feel that it is an extension of their incarceration. As you can see from the picture there, is that it is, dormitory style setting. Privacy is not our main concern or our main priority. Security is. So you can see from the locker there is that we want to be able to see what's in the contents of a locker before we approach a locker. We designed those lockers specifically for security purposes. They're kind of lower so that an average person can see on top, and then you can see through it. People that are in a community correction center are, subject to PAT searches, urinalysis, breathalyzers, and also we use technology to do a scan of the individual's body to see if they're introducing any contraband. So as you can imagine, as you could kind of get the feel, is that folks kind of see that as an extension of their incarceration. So with that, so people that find themselves in a community correction center are people that don't have a home plan. So going back historically, community correction centers were designed for pre-release purposes for folks that were doing, say, for example, a 5 to 10 year sentence, and their adjustment was very good. They did everything they were supposed to. They were able to pre-release 1 year prior to their minimum and complete their sentence out in the community. That ended a few years back, and what we have is primarily a parole population. And that population is a population that doesn't have a viable home plan to go home to. So they have been granted release by the board, but don't have a place to go that has been approved by supervision staff. So they find themselves in a community correction center. And there's 31 of them throughout the state, and the population right now is about 2,000 people. So this population is not considered homeless. So they don't have access to funding sources. So they're kind of in these community correction centers. Most of them are working. Most of them are able to make that transition and leave. But the important thing is that the community correction centers do have a cost of about $2,100 a month per person to occupy that space. It's staffed 24/7, and it has, as I mentioned, pretty robust security measures associated with it. So one of the things that we did back in 2012, 2013, as a result of justice reinvestment, is to look at how to better serve a population out in a community, one, with their treatment needs, and two, with supportive services, and three, with the, in terms of housing assistance. I've been with the department for 36 years now, and I go back to the days of, basically trail them, nail them, and jail them sort of mentality. So years ago, when I first joined the Department of Corrections, this would not even be a consideration. As a matter of fact, years ago, I was denied a position because they felt that I was too treatment oriented. Fast forward, a few years later, we were able to design these reentry categories to help make that transition back out to the community. So from sex offender treatment to day reporting, mentoring, everything's right there, workforce development. We provide, in contract with community providers out to provide these services. So right now we have well over 200 locations and about 80 providers, doing some combination or just a service category. But today I want to talk to you about the housing assistance program, and then the new REACH program that we're implementing very, very soon. So going to the housing assistance program, what we wanted to do was to provide an opportunity. When I ran a center, years ago, is that there were people in that facility that needed a little bit of money to move on and be on their way. However, it took them so long to save a little bit of money. But we would consider, startup costs, because they're coming out with essentially nothing. In order for them to save, even if they're working, to save for first month's rent, security deposit, it took them a long time to do this, months and months to do this, when they just needed a hand. So I wish at the time when I ran a center that I could simply, quote unquote, write a check and get that person out the door and get the next person in the queue out into the center. So the housing assistance program was kind of born out of a different way to spend that same money. And all the service categories are similarly presented that way. It was a result of justice reinvestment. How can we better spend that money as opposed to trail and nail them and jail them? But if we could support that transition in a meaningful way, we could help individuals stay out in the community longer, particularly with that essential first 6 months post-incarceration. So the housing assistance program is basically the target population is that, reentrants housed in a community corrections center or in the community, and they are unable to secure housing or residing in a center, emergency shelter, three-quarters house, or someplace not meant for human habitation. They must have employment 20 plus hours a week for 4 weeks, and verifiable source of income. And exclusion is anybody that's time driven to be in a community correction center. So say, for example, the parole board has determined that he or she must stay in a community correction center for 6 months. We're not going to put them in a housing assistance program at that point because they have to be there for X amount of time. But in fiscal year that just concluded on June 30th of 2023, we had placed 259 people into the community in housing. And that builds on the success that we've been having over the course of the last 10 years in getting folks into the community and out of a center efficiently. My goal with the utilization of those beds is not to increase them, but to use them more efficiently. So in our heyday, probably about 6 years ago, before we implemented a lot of these programs, is that we had 5,000 people in community correction centers. Today, we have about 2,000. A lot of different initiatives and a lot of different things happened to get that number down, one of which was this housing assistance program. Right now, we have about 7 or 8 providers statewide that are offering these services. for us, but we find, they're mainly in Philadelphia, Harrisburg, and in Pittsburgh. What we want to do is expand this program and expand the capacity in order to help those individuals, transition back out into the community. So again, as I mentioned, you must have a verifiable income. The apartment must be within 30-45% of rent to income ratio. There's case management and educational components associated with the contract and that person's participation. And we kind of categorize people into two areas, a low need and a high need. Don't confuse this low need and high need with risk. We're just trying to make a determination as to what level of help that individual needs. So $2,100 for a low need individual, which we have a tool that we work with the provider to make that determination. And then high need would be $6,300 plus associated renting associated expenses. So basically the math here is about $700 a month for rent. So think of it in terms of a bucket. The $2,100, we kind of think of it in terms of 3 months worth of rent. We know that that isn't going to cover that. But once that bucket is done, in terms of $2,100, $6,300, that bucket is now extinguished or empty. So we got to layer, other funding sources or other programming to get that person going. But oftentimes they're able to cover that rent from that point forward. This is intended to be a scattered site approach. As I mentioned about those community correction centers, if you don't have one in your community, it's often the place where community members might feel strongly about. It's the place that houses those people that did those crimes from this city, right? So we want to kind of scatter through the housing assistance program people out in the community, with landlords, through through a lease agreement with that individual. So that would be a landlord-tenant relationship. So you would help facilitate that transaction. And yes, and fair market rent is something that we is part of the contract as well. So we want to make sure of that. So again, $700 is not intended to cover everything. We know that it's not going to cover as much. So the reentrant and the provider kind of work out how that's going to go. They go halves and have it last a little longer, or they could spend it pretty quickly. But still, there's a requirement for case management. There's a requirement for the educational components to make sure that sustainability is achieved. We don't want a situation, and we strive not to have a situation where we place somebody in an apartment and he or she's not a good tenant. He or she doesn't have a good relationship with the landlord. He or she doesn't pay their rent. He or she doesn't understand their responsibilities or their rights. So we want to make sure that case management component remains for up to a year for these re-entrants in this program. So there's a lot more detail, and I'm not going to get into the detail. That's all in the contract that I'll talk about later on, associated with the housing assistance program. But we'll, so any questions, we could hold until the end, or you could, once you read the contract, you could ask them at that point. I'll make myself available, and my email address is included here as well. So one of the things that we did was also look into, there was a population at those facilities, at those centers, that we weren't reaching with the housing assistance program. Remember, I said that you have to have a job, and without a job, you didn't qualify. But there's a population at those centers that we weren't reaching. Is that basically that population is an older population, a disabled population, folks that might be beyond their ability to work, and they were kind of getting stuck at the center, and again at a high price. As I mentioned, $2,100 a month. Those folks weren't transitioning out very quickly. So through A grant that we got with DOJ is that we were able to get a new contract in place, and the goal is to get harder to serve re-entrants out of a center and into permanent housing. And as you can see, the target population is those that aren't able to earn income with disabilities or senior residents. And our target population, because this is a grant, is that we're starting with Lackawanna County, Dauphin County, and Allegheny County, in the contiguous areas, around Lackawanna, Dauphin, and Allegheny. So it's not just those counties, but we have providers in those markets that are able to help us. And the cool thing about this is that this is incentive based, right? We'll talk about that a little bit further down. Is that what we're trying to do is to incentivize, well, not only pay for a process, but pay for an outcome, right? We want that thing. And that thing is to have that person housed. And that other thing is not to have that person return back to prison, right? So those are two key measures here, is to get somebody into either initial or permanent housing, get them out of a center, and then keep them out of prison. And what we're trying to measure here is, will this have an impact on recidivism? So our money is that we will have a positive impact on recidivism. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So one of the things that we had to do here is to have a very robust eligibility criteria for this population, this specific population that we're trying to reach. We started this, anybody that worked at a center, knows this, is that when you see them, right? That person comes in, they don't have resources, they're disabled, they might even, have significant issues in terms of durable medical devices, they're in a wheelchair, or they're just unable to walk without assistance. Like, that person is, the one that we're trying to reach. But we had to put words around this. So these are the words around who we're trying to paint the picture of and trying to reach in this program. One of the key things, and I want to mention this to this population here, is that in order to be able to provide reach to our populations, you must have 1 year of experience in our regular housing assistance program. These are two separate service categories. So if you come on board with the housing assistance program, provide that for a year, then you could do the REACH program if you're in Lackawanna, Dauphin, or Allegheny, or in those contiguous areas. But once we prove this case, once we prove that one, we can get people out and keep them out of prison, then we're going to expand this, right? So this is kind of an experiment, right? That's what these grants are basically for, is to do an experiment to see if this model would work. And again, it's kind of recreated our procurement process and forced us to think about things in a different way. And the important thing, as I mentioned before, is not just to pay for a process, but to pay for an outcome and have that incentive. With this population, we're looking at $8,400 with that. So basically a year's worth of rental assistance. 700 times 12 is $8,400. With this population's enhanced case management and incentive payments for meeting certain goals, which we will discuss now. So the goal or the incentives is to place that person in initial housing. And if that's accomplished within 6 months of the referral, there would be an incentive of $720, and that's paid by individual. So if Johnny gets a initial housing placement, then that would be $720 for the provider in terms of incentive. If we get Johnny into permanent housing, right, which is a year's lease in their name for a minimum of 1 year, within 12 months of the referral, the provider would qualify for the incentive of $1,800 per individual. If we get that person from a center and into permanent housing directly, then the provider would get both of those incentives, right? So it doesn't mean that you have to go step by step, but if you hit a home run, so to speak, and get that person into permanent housing, then the provider would get both of those incentives. And then recidivism reduction. Anything that the department does has to be based on recidivism, and we measure that. The one thing that the department does very well is that we, run prisons, right? We run prisons, well. Other things that we don't do well, what we try to do and we experiment with, and one of the things is this program. So it's important, and why I want to talk to this audience is that we're looking to partner with folks like you to help that reentrant population. So with the recidivism reduction, it is based basically on cohorts measured 21 months after the approval of the referral. And if you meet the recidivism reduction, it'll be 1,080. Or 50% would be 540. And if you fail to meet the recidivism reduction, there will be no incentive, right? So basically what we want to do here in simple terms is we have a baseline recidivism rate on this population. And not to get too wonky on this, but basically based on that baseline, if you improve it, right? If you have a positive impact on that recidivism, for the cohort, you would get 100%. If you have no impact, you would get 50%, right? And then if you have a negative impact, then you would get 0 in terms of recidivism reduction, right? So the point is that we don't want to have a higher recidivism rate with this population. And if that is the outcome of this experiment, then we know not to continue doing it, right? My money, or what I'm betting on, is that we would have a positive impact on this population, or at least no more or no less of an impact, but we would save money on getting people out of a community correction center. But really what we're going for is to have a positive impact. And the numbers are achievable. We looked at those numbers in terms of this population, and I think that they're very achievable rates, but that'll be measured at 21 months after the approval. So again, I just want to emphasize that this is a program that we're looking to implement. We haven't started it yet, but hopefully we'll get the go ahead very, very soon. But in order for you to participate in this type of program, we would need to be in the regular housing assistance program for a year. And in terms of numbers, when I mentioned those 7 or 8 providers that we have, right now they're handling about 400 or 444, I think the number was the last report I saw, of reentrants. And again, we're not, we don't have statewide coverage. There's more people that have the need, but we just don't have enough providers to fill that need in terms of the referrals. So I just want to talk a little bit about funding. This is all state dollars, with the exception of the incentives that I mentioned from the federal government. And the federal government's only covering the incentives. We're covering the day-to-day operational costs. So last fiscal year, it costed the Commonwealth $43 million to operate the community corrections programs. I said 31 different facilities, some state operated, some of them contracted. And in the non-residential housing, the housing assistance program, we spent $1.1 million. So between the two, in terms of housing reentrants, either in a center or out in the community, we spent $44.1 million. The important thing too is that I'm looking to reduce the amount of money that we spend in residential and increase the money that we spend in non-residential. So we have the funding in place. We have the referrals, we have the bodies, but we need the providers, okay? So, as opposed to a lot of things right now, if we don't spend the money, we're not going to get the money. We're not going to get it reallocated in subsequent years. So I want to make sure that we have enough providers to fill that need. So again, we have the funding, we have the reentrant population, but we certainly need additional providers to fill that space. So before I get into the really boring stuff, I'll check the chat here. Okay, nothing new. All right, so moving along, contracting with us. It's a process. You know, I wish I could tell you that it's a simple thing, but it is not. So what you have to do is go through the DGS, Department of General Services website, and the link is provided here, and you would get the statement of work, which includes general and specific requirements. So in the front of the statement of work will be language that applies to all the service categories, and then you'll see language applicable to the specific service categories. So say, for example, sex offender treatment, we're going to have specific language in that service category that won't apply to the housing assistance program or to the mentoring program, and vice versa. So when you look at the statement of work, you have to go and look at, you know, lot 3, which is our housing assistance program, and find that language in addition to the general language that's applicable to all of them. And then the attachments are the rate card, you know, how much we pay for the services, terms and conditions, and things of that nature. And then you would submit your response through the Jagger system, and assistance can be provided to you from the folks at DGS on the Jagger homepage. And once you submit all that, and through our office, through our business office or administration office, I will get the bid submission, and then we'll review it and then proceed, or ask you for additional information or clarifying information. So you're welcome to look at that. In here we're going to, I provided my email address and my contact information so that you could correspond with me directly. We have 3 program managers that kind of act as a regional liaison in the east, central, and western part of the state. And we could work through them or with them to help onboard you should you be interested in doing this. And basically all the referrals come through, the agent. So the parole agent acts as that gatekeeper, as well as community correction staff and the counselors there. So it's not a question of self-referrals from the reentrant population. The agent has to make that referral through our system, and then that referral is approved or denied, and then it gets sent to the provider through our process. And I want to go back a second here and also mention, what the housing assistance program is not. The housing assistance, in terms of rental assistance, for those that are already been housed. It is not utility assistance for those that are already been housed, right? And oftentimes we get some confusion as to what it is and what it isn't. But what we're looking to do is to house individuals that are not permanently housed now. Once they are permanently housed, and they've done that on their own or through other means, we don't go back and provide them housing assistance, rental assistance. That would be through other mechanisms and other funding sources. So our goal is to get people into housing, again, in a scattered site approach. And here's our contact information. Again, I'm Louis Resto. I'm the Division Director for Reentry Services and Housing. We also have a housing coordinator. Her name is Sean Johnson. You can reach Sean at that mail address as well. My direct supervisor is Dan McIntyre, and Morris Richardson is with the Bureau of Community Corrections. All right, so we got something here. I think there's a question. When you're getting those into housing, are you connecting them to case management? Yes. So the provider that we contract with, takes care of that. So they would, work with the landlords to identify, appropriate places for these individuals. And sometimes those places might be case specific, right? So, a sex offender might be limited in terms of where he or she can go. But the provider works with the reentrant to identify places and potential landlords. The reentrant bring a landlord, to you, that says that this landlord's interested in renting to me. But everything that we do is also by choice, right? So we don't want to force anybody to go anywhere. We're not doing oh goodness, the word escapes me right now. Master leasing, that's it, or anything like that, right? So this is an open market, so that landlord can rent to that reentrant, or they can rent to somebody in the general public. But case management should follow for up to a year with that individual, and up to 2 years for the high need individual. So we want to make sure that that person is supported, in addition to whatever else needs to occur within within the home, referrals to the food bank, referrals to places where they can get furniture and assistance with heat or whatever else that person is going to need. Because that funding is only going to get them so far. The key, I think, or the magic is going to be in that case management that leads to sustainability. What we really don't want to do is create a crisis or manufacture a crisis at the end of this, right? We want to keep that person housed at that location for the next 10 years if they so choose to be. Yes. So if I understand, Tiffany, your question, for the REACH program, yes, we are targeting people from those areas. And so if you're going back to Dauphin County and you're in a community correction center, you're most likely in a community correction center in Dauphin County, right? So one of the criteria for REACH is that you must be housed in a community correction center. That is not the same criteria for the regular housing assistance programs. Remember, we got two different programs for two different populations. So if you are in a center in Dauphin County and you intend to stay in Dauphin County, then you would be eligible for REACH if you meet the other criteria for that. You might be housed because of bed space and capacity issues. You might be housed in a different community correction center, say in Dauphin County, but you intend to go to Lackawanna County. We can make that referral to the provider in Lackawanna County and work, with that reentrant in Lackawanna County. Hopefully, we can get that person moved to Lackawanna County if that's where they intend to go. But sometimes, capacity and bed space is a concern. And again, we don't have a center in every county and every location. And so the question here, what are some barriers to housing reentrants that you're facing when you're trying to house? Well, I think one of the things is, just the nature of who they are, right? Is, and engaging with those landlords, and separate fact from fiction. Sometimes the oftentimes the pro agent is vital in this, is to kind of talk about, what this thing looks like. Because oftentimes, landlords might be scared, might be concerned, might not even want the trouble, their perceived trouble of renting to, a felon or whatever the case is. Also, some of the barriers are affordability, but I think that's true of everybody right now. Is being able to find a place that falls within that 30 to 45%. Again, and those numbers are important, because if that rent to income ratio is lower than 30%, he or she does not need our help. If it's higher than 45%, then we feel that it won't be sustainable, it won't be affordable. So sometimes, right now, affordability has become an issue. One of our providers, didn't rebid with us because they can't find affordable housing for them. And their words were basically, where we can place them, you don't want them to be, based on the market right now. And that's a very difficult thing. So any other questions? We kind of transitioned into the questions here. But I think to kind of conclude here a little bit, is that this gives you a little bit of a primer of what we're trying to do. And the community correction centers are important. And as I mentioned, we have 31 of them throughout the state. But I think that assisting those folks in transitioning back out into the community and into housing is the future of community corrections. The housing assistance program and the other, the service categories that I mentioned to you, that's the future. This is where we really want this thing to go, is into a more non-residential level of care and programming. As you can imagine, operating a community correction center means that we see everything, right? We're living with that person. We see what they're doing or not doing, and if they came back or didn't come back. So while one of the criticisms of community correction centers is that the recidivism rate of people placed in a community correction center is high, it is a natural consequence when you do observe the behavior and you report the behavior, right? So we can't ignore behavior. We have to report that behavior. And it does, it bump up our recidivism numbers. What we want to do is to get that person into a non-residential setting, get that person into a housing assistance program, if necessary, and or be very efficient in approving home plans and getting that person out into the community. So again, not everybody goes to the housing assistance program, not everybody gets referred. What we want to do is make sure that we get the right person at the right time for the right reasons, into the right program, which in some cases is a housing assistance program. So again, if you have any questions, that's my email address. And if you have a pen handy and it's ready, I'm going to let me put it in the chat, as I was giving you my cell phone number, so that if you have any questions, you can reach out to me directly. Okay. Helen, I think I'm done, if there's no other questions.
Great, wonderful. I am going to stop the recording.